Mom's hands were clasped so tightly that her wedding ring had turned the skin beneath it white. "The ER and the surgeons kept him alive," she whispered. "But his platelet count keeps collapsing. The blood bank says a sibling is their best lead for an HLA-compatible donor. Erin, please let them test you." Behind her, the ICU doors kept opening and closing. Every time they moved, I caught a glimpse of blue scrubs, a monitor flashing red, and my father sitting beneath a television screen, with soot still ground into the lines of his face. A year earlier, those same hands had slid a folder across a hospital table and ended the financial support for my daughter's treatment in less than 3 minutes. "We're out of money. Handle it yourself." That same month, my parents had stood on the porch of a newly purchased house beside my older brother, smiling beneath a silver banner that read, "Our best investment yet." Now Mom reached for me. I stepped back. "Family is supposed to show up when it matters," she said, her voice breaking. Through the glass, Colin lay beneath tubes and bandages. For one terrible second, I remembered the 8-year-old boy who had studied the back of my bicycle seat, not the man who had signed his name beneath a lie that nearly cost my daughter her treatment. Mom squeezed her hands together again. "Please save your brother." I let the silence sit between us until she could no longer look me in the eye. Then I said the words she had taught me to understand. "I don't think this is a good investment. Stay with me to discover what my parents had hidden inside that house, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened next." The star-shaped bandage on Nora's hand had begun to peel at one corner. She slept beside me in the infusion room, with her cheek pressed against a folded sweatshirt, while clear medication traveled through the line beneath the bandage. I sat in a plastic chair with my banking app open, adding the same expenses for the third time as though the answer might become kinder if I checked it carefully enough. Parking was $22. The prescription waiting downstairs was $86 after insurance. Our deductible had reset in January. I had already used 4 unpaid days that month, and the extended stay room near the hospital had raised its weekly rate again. Nora's insurance covered most of the approved treatment itself, but it did not cover every supportive medication, every mile driven, every meal eaten from a vending machine, or the hours I could not work while my daughter was attached to an IV pole. 3 years earlier, after my husband Adam died in a workplace accident, I had placed part of his life insurance and settlement into the Nora Lawson Irrevocable Medical Support Trust. It was meant to fill those gaps. Treatment, recovery, temporary housing near the hospital, and whatever Nora needed to remain stable, while I kept our ordinary bills paid. I had made my parents the trustees because, at the time, I could barely remember to eat. Mom had spent most of her career managing a bank branch. Dad understood contracts and construction costs. Adam had trusted both of them. When they volunteered to handle the paperwork, I had mistaken relief for safety. A nurse touched my shoulder and told me my parents were waiting in the family consultation room. Nora stirred when I stood, but Dr. Priya Shah was reviewing her chart nearby and promised to stay until I returned. I kissed Nora's forehead and followed the nurse down the hall. Mom had placed a blue folder in the center of the small table. A brown coffee stain marked one corner. Dad sat beside her with both hands resting on his knees, his expression already closed. Mom did not ask how Nora was feeling. "The trust is almost depleted," she said. "Your father and I reviewed everything. We cannot continue authorizing these withdrawals." I looked from her to Dad. "What withdrawals? The hospital is still billing insurance. The trust is covering the part insurance does not." "That part keeps growing," Mom replied. "Travel, medications, temporary lodging, missed work. There is always another expense." They were the expenses the trust was created to cover. Dad cleared his throat. "We agreed to fund the current cycle. After that, there will be no further distributions." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood them. Dr. Shah said Nora is showing enough response to continue. She never promised certainty, but there is a medical reason to keep going. Mom's mouth tightened. "A reason is not a guarantee. She is 9 years old, and we have already done more than our share," Mom said. This family has survived medical disasters before. We emptied accounts when Colin had that construction accident 6 years ago. He needed surgeries and repeated transfusions, and somehow everyone expected us to absorb that too. We cannot keep making decisions as though money is endless. I barely heard the last sentence. My fingertips had gone numb against the edge of the table. The hum of the air conditioner faded until the room seemed sealed around us. Mom pushed the folder toward me. The coffee stain stopped inches from my hand. We're ending support for your daughter's treatment. We're out of money. Handle it yourself. She said it in the same tone she used to explain an overdraft fee. No anger, no hesitation, just a decision entered into a ledger and closed. I opened the folder, but the pages blurred. Show me the complete accounting. You will receive the annual statement, Mom said. There is nothing unusual in it. Then show it to me now. Dad leaned forward. Do not turn this into an accusation. We are trying to protect what remains. For whom? Before either of them answered, Mom's phone rang. Colin's name appeared on the screen. She answered without checking whether the speaker was on. Did you get that situation handled? He asked. Mom's finger struck the speaker icon, but not before his voice filled the room. Yes, she said quickly. We are finishing now. There was a pause. Good. We need to move forward. She ended the call. I stared at her. He knew? This affects the whole family, she replied. Of course he knew we were reviewing our finances. I wanted to shout, but Nora was 2 doors away. I wanted to demand every bank record, every receipt, every signature. Instead, I closed the folder and stood, because survival had already begun, and anger would not pay for the prescription waiting downstairs. When I returned to the infusion room, Nora was awake. Her eyes moved from my face to the folder tucked under my arm. Grandma said something about a bad return, she whispered. Was she talking about me? My chest tightened so sharply that I had to sit beside her. No, sweetheart. They are worried about money, not about you. It was the first lie I told to protect my parents from the consequences of their own words. Nora accepted my answer and reached for the sketchbook on her tray. Between drawings of windows and crooked rooftops was a glossy property brochure Mom had brought the week before. It showed a pale 2-story house with an arched window and a wide front porch. Mom had told Nora the trust might buy a small place near the hospital so we would not have to keep paying for temporary rooms during recovery. A yellow sun, drawn in Nora's wax crayon, filled the upper corner of the brochure. Can we still live here someday? She asked. I looked at the blue folder, then at the house Mom had once described as part of Nora's future. I don't know, I said. But you will be back here for treatment next week, I promise. That night, after Nora fell asleep, I opened my banking app at the kitchen table. Once I subtracted rent, the prescription, transportation, food, and the next hospital payment, my personal savings would carry us for less than 3 weeks. My phone vibrated against the table. Colin Whitaker invited you to big family announcement. I turned the screen face down, but Nora had come quietly into the kitchen for water. She had already seen the little house icon beside the invitation. Is Uncle Colin buying a house? She asked. I did not know yet that the answer would explain where my daughter's future had gone. I deleted Colin's invitation twice before Mom called and told me I was being childish. This family needs one good day, she said. For months, everything has been hospitals, prescriptions, and bills. Colin has worked hard for this. The least you can do is show up. It had been 12 days since she and Dad slid the blue folder across the hospital table. Neither of them had asked whether I had found a way to pay for Nora's next treatment. Mom spoke as though the problem had been resolved, because she had stopped looking at it. I'm not in the mood for a celebration, I said. It isn't about your mood. Nora wants to see her grandparents. That was the sentence that got me. Nora had asked twice why Grandma had not called. I had told her they were busy, just as I had told her the words, bad return, had nothing to do with her. Each lie bought my parents another day of innocence in my daughter's eyes. I agreed to stay for 20 minutes. The address led us to an older neighborhood west of Columbus, where narrow brick homes stood beside houses being gutted and rebuilt. Colin's property sat at the end of a quiet street beneath two tall maple trees. It was a pale two-story house with a wide porch, an arched window above the front door, and fresh white paint covering wood that still sagged near the gutters. A silver banner stretched between the porch columns. Our best investment yet. Colin stood beneath it, holding an oversized brass key made for photographs. He wore a navy blazer over an open-collar shirt, and Mom kept adjusting his sleeve as a photographer moved them closer together. Dad stood on Colin's other side, with one hand on his shoulder. They looked like a family in an advertisement. Nora squeezed my fingers. "Did Uncle Colin win the house?" Before I could answer, Mom noticed us and opened her arms. "There are my girls." Nora ran toward her. I followed more slowly, watching Mom kneel to hug my daughter as if she had not recently calculated how much of the family's money Nora was worth risking. "You look so much better," Mom said. It was not true. Nora was pale from treatment, and her knitted cap sat slightly crooked above one eyebrow. Mom had not seen her in nearly 2 weeks, but she spoke as if improvement could be declared by choosing the right tone. Dad kissed Nora's forehead and then nodded at me. "Glad you came." I looked past him into the house. The front room had been stripped to bare studs. Plastic covered part of the floor, and several sections of plaster had been opened around the ceiling. The kitchen cabinets were old. The counters were cracked, and a dark stain spread beneath one of the windows. "This is the announcement?" I asked. Colin stepped between us with the giant key resting on his shoulder. "The first Whitaker family redevelopment project." He said it loudly enough for the photographer and the dozen guests on the lawn to hear. Several people applauded. Mom guided Nora toward a folding table covered with pastries and sparkling cider. On the table sat printed renderings of how the house would look after renovation. The drawings showed new floors, an open kitchen, and a landscaped backyard. I turned to Mom. "You bought this." "We made an investment," she corrected. Dad joined us, already smiling in the way he did when explaining something he considered too complicated for me. "The neighborhood is changing. Colin found the property before it was listed publicly. With the right work, it could increase substantially in value." "With what money?" His smile disappeared. Mom lowered her voice. "Not here. You told me 12 days ago that you were out of money. We said the resources available for Nora's ongoing expenses were nearly exhausted." "No, you said you were out of money and told me to handle it myself." Several guests had begun watching us. Mom took my elbow and tried to lead me away from the porch, but I pulled free. "This purchase came from a completely different financial structure," she said. "It has nothing to do with your situation. My situation is your granddaughter's treatment." Colin came down the steps and handed the oversized key to the photographer. "Aaron, can we not do this today?" I looked at the banner above his head. "You invited me." "I invited my sister to celebrate something positive. I didn't invite an interrogation." Nora had stopped eating the cookie Mom gave her. She stood beside the table, listening. I tried to lower my voice. "They ended support for her treatment less than 2 weeks ago. Now they're buying you a house. You don't think I deserve to ask where the money came from?" Colin's jaw tightened. "This is not a house for me to live in. It's a project. Whose name is on it?" "That's not the point." "It seems like the point." Mom stepped between us. "Colin is creating something that can grow. The profits from this house can fund future projects and provide security for the entire family." I stared at her. "Including Nora?" No one answered. Colin glanced toward the guests and forced a smile. "You are comparing two completely different things. Treatment can fail. Property holds value." The words landed with such calm certainty that for a second I wondered whether he understood what he had said. Nora looked up at him. Colin noticed and immediately softened his voice. "I'm talking about financial planning, kiddo, not you." But he had been talking about her. Everyone on that porch knew it. Mom picked up a glass and tapped it with a spoon, calling the guests closer for a toast. I should have taken Nora and left then. Instead, I remained long enough to hear my mother praise Colin for having the courage to think beyond immediate problems. He understands that families need more than hope, she said. They need assets. They need something solid that can outlast uncertainty. Dad raised his glass toward Colin. To the best investment we have ever made. The guests repeated the words. Nora tugged at my sleeve. Her eyes were fixed on the arched window above the front door. Mom, she whispered. I know this house. I crouched beside her. What do you mean? It was in Grandma's paper. She hurried toward the display table before I could stop her. Beneath the polished renovation plans were several copies of the original property brochure. Nora picked one up and pointed to the arched window. This is the house Grandma said would be near my hospital. The conversation around us stopped. Mom placed her glass down too quickly. Cider spilled across the white tablecloth. Nora, sweetheart, that was only one idea we considered. You said Mom and I could stay here so we wouldn't have to drive so far. The plan changed. Why? Mom looked at me, rather than answering her. Nora lowered her eyes to the brochure. A small yellow sun had been drawn in wax crayon, near the lower corner, its uneven rays extending across the printed image of the roof. I drew that, she said. Mom snatched the paper from her hand. The movement was too fast and too frightened for something she claimed meant nothing. This is just an old copy, she said, folding it in half. You probably drew on several brochures. Nora shook her head. Only that one. I watched Mom place the folded paper beneath the other documents, hiding the yellow corner from view. Colin clapped his hands and announced it was time for photographs inside. Guests began moving toward the porch, eager to escape the silence. Dad opened the front door and told everyone to watch their step around the exposed flooring. I took Nora's hand. We're leaving. Mom followed us down the walkway. Aaron, don't punish Colin because you are overwhelmed. I stopped beside my car. What was important about the day you ended my daughter's support? Her face hardened. We did not end her treatment. You ended the promise that was supposed to make treatment possible. You always make everything sound crueler than it is. No, I've spent years making it sound kinder. I helped Nora into the passenger seat and drove away before Mom could answer. We made it 3 blocks before Nora spoke. Does Uncle Colin's house deserve to live more than I do? I pulled into the parking lot of a closed pharmacy and turned off the engine. I had no sentence large enough to repair what she had heard. I leaned across the console and held her until her knitted cap pressed against my cheek. No house is worth more than you, I said. You are going back to the hospital next week, exactly when Dr. Shaw scheduled you. I promise. How? I'll figure it out. It was the only promise I had left that still belonged entirely to me. That night, after Nora went to bed, I opened my laptop to review our remaining money again. An automatic email from the company administering the trust appeared at the top of my inbox. Annual beneficiary statement available. I downloaded the document and began reading each entry. Most were familiar. Pharmacy payments, hospital lodging, transportation reimbursements, and medical equipment. Then I reached a withdrawal dated 3 days before my parents told me the trust was nearly empty. Temporary medical housing. The amount beside it was $165,000. I read the line until the numbers stopped looking like numbers. Temporary medical housing. $165,000. The withdrawal had been approved 3 days before my parents told me the trust was nearly empty. I clicked through every page of the statement, searching for an address, a receipt, or the name of the person who had received the money. All I found was a transaction code and the name WCR Holdings LLC. I had never heard of the company. The next morning, I called the trust administrator before taking Nora to the hospital. The representative confirmed that the payment had been authorized by both trustees, but she could not give me the underlying documents because I was not listed as an account manager. I'm her mother, I said. Nora is the beneficiary. You may submit a written request for supporting records, she replied. The trustees will be notified. The last thing I wanted was to warn my parents before I understood what I had found. I thanked her, ended the call, and saved 3 copies of the statement. One went to my personal email, one to an encrypted folder on my work laptop, and one to a flash drive I kept in Adam's old lockbox. Then I began selling the life we had built before he died. Adam's Subaru was the first thing of real value to go. It was 11 years old, but he had maintained it carefully, recording every oil change in a small notebook he kept in the glove compartment. The driver's seat still carried the shape of his shoulders. A faint coffee stain darkened the console where he had spilled a full cup during a winter commute and laughed so hard that he had to pull over. I sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes before handing the keys to the buyer. Nora watched from the townhouse window. When I returned inside, she asked whether Dad's car was coming back. No, I said. We don't need 2 parking spaces anymore. It was easier than telling her I had traded one of the last physical pieces of her father for 6 weeks of medicine, rent, and hospital trips. The townhouse went next. Our lease was ending in 2 months, and the renewal increase would have swallowed what remained from the car. I found a small second-floor apartment near a bus route that stopped 3 blocks from the hospital. It had 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a living room just wide enough for a fold-out couch. I gave Nora the bedroom. She stood in the doorway on moving day and studied the blank walls. Where will you sleep? On the couch. It's closer to the coffee. She did not smile. That evening, she unpacked her sketchbook and drew a house with 2 windows, but no door. I almost asked why she had left it out, but she was already erasing part of the roof because it leaned too far to one side. My manager allowed me to work remotely on treatment days, but my regular hours were no longer enough. After Nora fell asleep, I logged back into the company system and reviewed disputed freight invoices for an overnight audit project. The work was tedious, but it paid by the batch. Most nights I stopped only when the numbers began to swim across the screen. One morning, I woke with my forehead against the keyboard and found Nora standing beside me in her school uniform. You said you would braid my hair. I looked at the clock. The bus would arrive in 9 minutes. Why didn't you wake me earlier? I tried. You need to speak louder when something matters. Her face changed immediately. She turned away and began gathering her hair into an uneven ponytail. The shame arrived before I finished the sentence. I caught her gently by the shoulders. I'm sorry. That wasn't your fault. You're always tired. I know. Is it because of me? The question hurt more than anything my parents had said. No, I'm tired because I'm trying to do too many things at once. None of that is your fault. I braided her hair at the kitchen counter while she ate half a granola bar. The braid came out crooked, but we made the bus. 2 days later, I missed a mandatory department meeting while speaking with the pharmacy assistance program. My manager, Karen, asked me to join a private video call. I've covered for you because I know what you're dealing with, she said. But compliance deadlines don't move because your life is difficult. I wanted to resent her, but she was not wrong. One overlooked invoice could expose the company to penalties. I understand. I need you available during core hours. If that can't happen, tell me now. I explained Nora's treatment schedule and offered to work the late audit queue in exchange for flexibility during infusion days. Karen studied me for a moment, then agreed to a 30-day trial. You miss another required meeting without notice, and I have to document it. I won't. I kept that promise by setting alarms for everything: medication, school, meetings, bus departures, application deadlines. My phone became the closest thing I had to another adult in the apartment. I applied everywhere I could. The hospital social worker helped me file for a pediatric assistance fund, a prescription copay program, transportation vouchers, and temporary meal support. None of them solved the whole problem. One covered part of a medication. Another reimbursed 2 trips each month. The meal card worked only inside the hospital cafeteria. Every approval came with another form, another deadline, and another request for proof that we were struggling enough to deserve help. At Nora's next appointment, Dr. Shah reviewed her blood work and explained that the early indicators were moving in the right direction. "Does that mean it's working?" I asked. "It means we have enough evidence to continue," she said. "I won't promise an outcome I cannot guarantee, but this treatment is medically justified." I looked down at the folder of bills in my lap. "My parents said we were spending money on uncertainty." Dr. Shaw folded her hands. "Most serious treatment contains uncertainty. Uncertain is not the same as worthless." Nora was drawing beside us and pretended not to listen, but her pencil stopped moving. I carried that sentence home with me. My parents disappeared from our daily lives, almost completely. Mom sent one message asking whether I had made arrangements. She did not ask what those arrangements were. Dad did not call at all. Colin posted often enough for all three of them. He uploaded videos of walls being torn down, old cabinets ripped out, and workers carrying lumber through the front door. He called the project his first step toward building generational wealth. In one clip, he stood in the unfinished kitchen and described how opening the floor plan would add $50,000 to the resale value. I watched 10 seconds, then closed the app. 6 weeks after we moved, the Pediatric Assistance Fund approved 3 months of partial support for Nora's medication. Karen quietly organized a system allowing coworkers to donate unused paid leave, and 7 people contributed before the end of the week. I cried in the employee restroom after reading the email. The following Monday, Dr. Shaw showed me Nora's latest results. The abnormal markers had decreased. Not enough to declare victory, but enough for her to say the word response. That evening, Nora ate an entire bowl of pasta and asked whether she could return to her online art class. For the first time since my parents cut us off, I allowed myself to believe we might survive without them. Then I opened the trust statement again. The $165,000 withdrawal had been made during the exact week Mom first showed Nora the property brochure. The transaction code included a reference to residential acquisition, but there was still no address. I searched county property records using my parents' names and found nothing. I tried the company name next. WCR Holdings LLC appeared on several renovation permits, but the publicly visible documents did not identify the owners. I searched Colin's posts for photographs of the original house, an enlarged one taken before the construction began. Nora leaned over the back of the couch. "That's the step." "What step?" She pointed to a shallow dent in the stone beside the front door. "The one in Grandma's paper." I colored around it because it looked like a smile. I took out my phone and found the picture I had snapped at Colin's announcement. The arched window matched. The porch columns matched. The dent in the step matched. "Grandma said we could stay there after the hospital," Nora added. "She said I wouldn't have to ride so far when I felt sick." The room seemed to narrow around me. The payment in the trust statement was not for some unknown apartment or temporary rental. It could be the house Colin was renovating. I did not call Mom. I did not send Colin an angry message. At work, when a transaction looked wrong, the fastest way to lose evidence was to accuse the person who controlled the records before securing copies. I downloaded the property images, saved the trust statement again, and wrote down every date I could confirm. Then I searched the Ohio Business Registry using the full company name. The filing opened a few seconds later. WCR Holdings LLC. The registered business name beneath it read Colin Whitaker Residential. At the bottom of the formation document was the organizer's signature. My brother's. The hospital social worker gave me 3 names and circled Naomi Brooks twice. "She handles trust disputes," she said. "She won't tell you what you want to hear just because your daughter is sick." That sounds useful. Naomi's office occupied the 2nd floor of an old brick building near downtown Columbus. She was in her 40s, with silver at her temples and a desk so orderly that my blue folder looked damaged on it. She read the trust statement, the Ohio business filing, and the photographs I had saved from Colin's announcement. She spent the longest time looking at Nora's yellow sun on the property brochure. "This is troubling," she said. But troubling is not the same as proven. I felt my shoulders tighten. The trust paid $165,000 for temporary medical housing. Colin's company received the house. We have a likely connection. We do not yet have the complete transaction. She turned a legal pad toward me and drew 4 short lines. Money source, authorized purpose, title holder, actual user. We need each one supported by a document, not by what your mother said at a hospital or what Colin posted online. I'm Nora's mother. Why can't I see everything? You are her legal guardian, but Marilyn and Douglas are the acting trustees. That gives them control over administration. It does not give them permission to use trust assets for themselves, and it does not erase your right to question whether an expense benefited Nora. Naomi explained that an Ohio probate court could order a formal accounting, stop a transfer, trace property purchased with trust money, and remove trustees who violated their duties. None of that would happen, because I walked into a courtroom angry. We need a petition, evidence, and a credible reason to believe the asset could be transferred or the records could disappear, she said. Until then, the court will not treat suspicion as a verdict. I looked at the photograph of Colin beneath the silver banner. What do we do first? We ask for the complete ledger, the purchase documents, all invoices tied to temporary housing, and every agreement involving WCR Holdings. We also send a preservation notice, telling them not to destroy or alter records. If they know I'm looking, they may move the house. That is why we move carefully and quickly. Naomi requested the public property file while I searched the county recorder's index from her conference table. The deed showed WCR Holdings as the owner. A preliminary closing summary listed a cash contribution of $165,000, but the copy available online did not identify the source. It was the second link. The first was Nora's brochure. The second was the exact amount used at closing. The third was WCR Holdings, formed and signed by Colin. Still, Naomi refused to call it theft. Not until we know whether the trust acquired an interest in the property, leased it, or was reimbursed through another arrangement, she said. Bad bookkeeping is not always fraud. By late afternoon, we found a commercial renovation loan recorded against the house. The amount looked large enough to explain the purchase. For several hours, I let myself believe the less terrible explanation. Maybe the bank had financed the house. Maybe the trust's payment had been returned or secured by the property. Maybe my parents had chosen Colin over Nora, but had not actually stolen from her. That possibility still hurt, but I understood it. Naomi obtained the loan summary the next morning. She called while I was helping Nora log into her online class. The loan was not used to buy the property, she said. It became available only after closing and reimburses approved renovation costs in stages. I stepped into the kitchen. So it paid for walls, flooring, and construction. Correct, not the initial acquisition. Then who paid the $165,000? That is now the central question. I emailed Mom a formal request for the trust accounting. She answered 6 hours later. The old records are in storage. We will retrieve them when time permits. Dad called instead of writing. You hired a lawyer against your own parents? I hired someone to find out where Nora's money went. You know where it went. Her care has cost a fortune. One transaction says temporary medical housing. You are reading documents you do not understand. Then, send me the documents that explain them. His voice hardened. Colin finally builds something for himself, and you cannot stand it. You have spent your whole life resenting his success. I almost listed every time I had helped Colin and watched him receive what I had been told to earn. Instead, I said, "Send the accounting." He hung up. Colin's message arrived a few minutes later. Don't turn Nora's illness into a weapon against me. I read it once and saved a screenshot. Then I placed the phone face down and helped Nora reconnect to her art class. She had enough energy to remain online for the entire lesson. The children were asked to draw a place where they felt safe. Nora drew a small white house with 2 windows and a red roof. When the teacher asked where the door was, Nora paused then added one in blue pencil. "It opens from the inside," she explained. That afternoon, the pharmacy assistance program approved another 3 months of medication support. The letter did not solve everything, but it gave me 90 days without treating every decision like an emergency. I printed the approval and taped it beside Nora's drawing. 2 days later, Naomi prepared the preservation notice. It was not a court order. It simply placed my parents and Colin on formal notice that documents, electronic records, construction files, and communications relating to the house and the trust could become evidence. A certified document courier agreed to deliver copies to each of them. Colin was at the renovation property, and I went with the courier because Naomi wanted confirmation of the address and the current condition of the house. The front door stood open. New flooring covered most of the first level, and the kitchen had been stripped down to exposed pipes and electrical lines. Dad was arguing with a man in work boots beside the utility room. The man introduced himself as Miguel Santos, a licensed mechanical contractor. A red tag hung from the gas control assembly. "Do not operate." Miguel pointed toward the altered line running into the kitchen. "This system stays off until the installation is inspected and permitted. The pressure reading is unstable, and this connection does not meet code." Dad folded his arms. "I installed gas lines before you were out of school. Then you know why I'm tagging it. We have a listing photographer coming next week. That does not change the hazard." Colin noticed me near the doorway. "What are you doing here?" The courier handed him the envelope and asked him to sign the delivery confirmation. Colin read Naomi's name and looked at me as if I had brought police officers into his home. Dad followed Miguel outside, still complaining about delays and unnecessary inspections. Miguel repeated that no one was to operate the system. He photographed the red tag, entered something on his tablet, and drove away. I remained near the porch while the courier completed his notes. Through the open doorway, I saw Dad return to the utility room. He looked toward Colin, then pulled the red tag from the assembly and folded it into his pocket. "Dad," I said. He turned. "That man said the system was unsafe. He said he wanted another inspection. He said not to operate it. This is my field, Aaron. Do not confuse a contractor protecting his invoice with an emergency." I took out my phone and photographed the open first floor. The image included the exposed gas line, the utility assembly, and the date displayed on a temporary construction clock mounted near the kitchen. Dad stepped toward me. "Delete that." "No." Colin moved between us. "You are trespassing. I'm leaving." As I walked back to my car, my hands shook, but not from fear of my father. For the first time, I understood that his confidence was not proof of competence. It was the reason he believed rules applied only to people with less experience than him. Naomi called that evening. "I received a partial disbursement packet from the trust administrator," she said. "You need to come in tomorrow." "Did they explain the payment?" "They documented its purpose." The next morning, she placed a single page in front of me. Purpose: Recovery Residence for Minor Beneficiary, Nora Lawson. Below it was a certification stating that the property would be occupied or used for Nora's medical recovery. The signature belonged to Colin Whitaker. 3 days after I saw Colin's signature beneath the false certification, Mom sent me an invitation to a private preview of the renovated house. The message said the event was for close family, potential investors, and a real estate photographer. She added that Colin hoped I would come without creating another scene. I showed the message to Naomi. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "No, but I want to look him in the eye when I ask why he signed Nora's name into a house she was never allowed to use." Naomi gave me a copy of the certification and reminded me not to threaten anyone with criminal charges. We had evidence strong enough to demand an explanation, not enough to decide the outcome ourselves. "Give them one clear opportunity to preserve the property and return the money voluntarily," she said. "Then leave." Nora stayed with a coworker from my department. I did not want her inside the house again, and I did not want her to hear my family explain why her medical future had been treated like movable capital. by the time I arrived, 2 luxury cars were parked along the curb, and a catering table had been arranged across the porch. The silver banner was gone. In its place stood a wooden sign bearing Colin's company logo and the words Whitaker Residential Preview. The sagging gutters had been replaced. The porch gleamed beneath new paint. Inside, the exposed walls were gone, the floors shone, and the kitchen had become a white marble display, designed to photograph well from every angle. The air smelled overwhelmingly of vanilla and cedar. Candles burned on the mantel, small diffusers released scented mist from the corners, and another fragrance machine hummed near the kitchen doorway. Colin stood beside the island, speaking to 2 men in suits. "My parents believed in me before anyone else did," he said. "This house proves what can happen when a family stops thinking only about immediate problems and starts building something lasting." Mom saw me near the entrance, but did not interrupt him. She waited until Colin raised his glass. "To the people who understood that security is created, not wished for." Dad lifted his drink first. Mom followed. "To the child who built something lasting," she said. Her eyes found mine across the room. I knew exactly what she meant. Colin had built something that could be photographed, appraised, and sold. Nora's treatment had offered no guaranteed return, so in my mother's mind, it belonged to the category of temporary problems. I waited until the investors moved toward the backyard. Then I asked Colin to speak privately. He led me into a small room staged as an office and closed the door halfway. I placed the certification on the desk between us. His eyes dropped to his signature. "You told the trust administrator this property would be used as Nora's recovery residence." He picked up the page but did not pretend it was unfamiliar. "That was how the transaction was structured." "That is not an answer." "It is the answer. The trust invested in a property that could have served a medical purpose if necessary. Nora never received a key. The house was not ready. You held a purchase celebration before telling me the trust paid for it. The trust supplied part of the acquisition. The renovation loan funded the work. When the property sells, the original amount can be restored with profit." I stared at him. "You took money intended to keep my daughter in treatment and gambled it on a house." "It wasn't a gamble. You listed Nora as the reason for the purchase, because the trust required a qualifying purpose." The casual way he said it stripped away the last excuse I had tried to preserve for him. He had not signed a page he misunderstood. He had understood exactly what the document needed to say. "What would have happened if Nora needed the money before you sold?" "You found other resources." "I sold Adam's car. We moved out of our home. I worked nights while sleeping in hospital chairs." Colin sighed as if my hardship were an argument he had already considered. "And now Nora is still receiving treatment. When this place sells, she could end up with more money than she had before, if she survives long enough for your investment to pay." His expression changed, but only for a second. "Don't say things like that." "Why?" "You built the transaction around the possibility that her treatment might fail." He lowered his voice. "Treatment can fail. Property holds value." I thought of Nora asking whether his house deserved to live more than she did. If Nora died before this house sold, who would hold that value? Colin looked toward the doorway rather than answering. Mom had been standing outside long enough to hear the question. She pushed the door fully open, and Dad stepped in behind her. "You are twisting this into something monstrous," Mom said. "We temporarily reallocated money into an appreciating asset. The trust did not authorize you to redesign Nora's future." "We are the trustees," she replied. "It was our responsibility to protect the funds from being exhausted." "By giving them to Colin?" "By creating growth." Dad pointed toward the document. "You see one certification, and think you understand investment strategy. Fear has controlled every decision you have made since Adam died. We chose not to let that fear destroy an opportunity for the whole family." Several guests had moved close enough to hear him. Colin glanced toward them, but Mom no longer seemed interested in privacy. "This house will be sold," she said. "The money will return to the trust. No one stole anything. You used Nora's illness to qualify the purchase. then kept the property for Colin's business. We made a decision you were too emotional to make. That sentence ended the part of me still waiting for an apology. I looked at Colin and remembered the refrigerator box he found behind an appliance store when we were children. He was 8, and I was 5. He dragged it into our backyard, cut windows into the sides, and drew a crooked door with a black marker. When neighborhood children tried to push me out, Colin stood in the doorway and told them it was our house. That night, while rain softened the cardboard walls, he promised that when he grew up, he would buy a real house, and no one would ever make me leave. "Do you remember the cardboard house?" I asked. His face tightened. "What does that have to do with this? You promised you would never let anyone push me outside. We were children. You signed a document using my daughter's name so you could own this place. Adults make choices based on what has a future." I folded the certification and returned it to my folder. "You have 72 hours to stop the sale and return the full $165,000 to Nora's trust." Dad gave a short laugh. "Or what?" "Naomi will file a petition for a formal accounting and preservation of the property. We will ask the probate court to trace the trust funds and prevent the proceeds from being moved." Mom's face lost some of its certainty. "You would expose your own family over a temporary accounting decision?" "I am protecting my daughter from people who believe her money belongs to whoever promises the highest return." A man's voice rose near the front entrance. Miguel Santos entered holding a tablet and a fresh red warning tag. He walked directly toward the utility room, then stopped when he saw the candles and scent machines throughout the house. "Why is the gas system operating?" Dad moved quickly toward him. "You are not welcome on this property. I came because the inspection record shows the tag was removed. The altered line has not been approved, and the pressure problem has not been cleared. The system is functioning. That does not mean it is safe." Miguel looked at Colin. "No appliance connected to that line should be operating. Shut it down, ventilate the house, and keep everyone out until the city inspection is complete. I am documenting this violation." Colin glanced toward the photographer setting up lights in the kitchen. "We only need the house working for the photo session," he said. "We'll correct everything afterward." Miguel stared at him. "Gas does not care about your schedule." Dad ordered him to leave. Miguel photographed the utility room, the removed tag, and the scent machines before walking back outside. I looked at the candles burning along the mantel. Their flames barely moved in the sealed room. "Stop the sale," I told Colin. "Return Nora's money and shut this house down until it is safe." Mom stepped between us. "We are not returning anything because you have decided to panic." Colin straightened his jacket and looked toward the guests who were pretending not to listen. "You won't destroy this family over a paperwork mistake. It stopped being a paperwork mistake when you signed your name." I walked out before they could turn the argument into another debate about my emotions. From my car, I called Naomi. They refused. "Do you want me to prepare the filing?" I watched through the window as Colin reopened the front door for the photographer. Mom adjusted the candles on the mantel while Dad followed Miguel toward the curb, still arguing. "File it," I said. That night, Naomi emailed confirmation that the petition for accounting and preservation of trust assets was ready for submission the next morning. Less than 10 minutes later, Colin posted a new listing announcement. The public open house had been moved forward by 2 weeks. Offers would be reviewed immediately after the event. They were going to move the money before I could reach it. Naomi filed the petition the morning after Colin moved up the open house. She asked the Franklin County Probate Court to compel a full accounting, preserve every asset connected to Nora's trust, and prevent any sale proceeds from being transferred until the court determined who actually owned the money invested in the property. She also requested an emergency hearing, but warned me that filing a petition did not instantly freeze the house. "A judge still has to review it," she said. "Until an order is entered, Colin may try to accept an offer." I refreshed the public listing between work assignments and hospital calls. By noon, Colin had added professional photographs. By 3, the listing had been marked as receiving early interest. Each polished image made the house look farther removed from the stripped walls, exposed pipes, and red safety tag I had seen with my own eyes. That afternoon, the trust administrator sent Naomi an expanded disbursement packet. The preservation notice and pending court action had apparently convinced them that withholding documents was no longer worth the risk. Naomi called me into her office and placed 4 pages in a row across the conference table. The first was a wire confirmation showing $165,000 transferred directly from Nora's trust into the title company's escrow account on the day WCR Holdings purchased the house. The second carried Mom's signature. She had certified that the expenditure was necessary to secure temporary medical housing for Nora during treatment and recovery. Dad had signed the third page. His report claimed the property required renovation to provide a safe, accessible environment suited to Nora's medical needs. The final page contained Colin's promise that Nora would be granted priority use of the property throughout her treatment. 3 signatures. 3 statements. 1 coordinated lie. They didn't take their own money and choose Colin over Nora, I said. Naomi shook her head. No, the initial purchase came from Nora's trust. The room remained still, but every sacrifice I had made seemed to return at once. Adam's Subaru disappearing down the street. Nora asking why we had left her bedroom. The fold-out couch cutting into my back. The alarms that divided every day into medication, work, transportation, and bills. The morning I blamed my daughter because exhaustion had made me cruel for 10 seconds. All that time, the money had not been gone. It had been trapped inside Colin's walls while my parents watched me dismantle our lives. Naomi tapped the documents. These pages make the request for preservation much stronger. They also make it difficult for any of them to claim ignorance. Can the court stop the sale now? She was submitting the supplemental evidence immediately. A temporary order was possible, but not guaranteed before the open house. I returned to the hospital carrying copies in my bag. Dr. Shaw met us in an examination room after Nora's blood draw and turned the monitor so I could see the results. The response is continuing, she said. Her markers have fallen again, and her blood counts are stable enough to remain on schedule. I held Nora's hand. Are you saying the treatment is working? I'm saying it is helping. We still have a long road, and we will continue monitoring for complications, but today's results are encouraging. Nora looked at me carefully. Can we be happy about it? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said. We can be happy today. We celebrated in the hospital cafeteria with a slice of chocolate cake large enough for 2 people. Nora ate the frosting first and drew a door on the paper napkin with a blue pen. For almost an hour, I did not think about court filings, houses, or my parents. I watched my daughter laugh when frosting stuck to my lip and allowed that small happiness to exist without demanding that it guarantee tomorrow. Mom was waiting outside our apartment when we returned. She sat in her car until Nora went inside, then approached me with a sealed envelope. We can resolve this privately, she said. Inside was a proposed agreement offering to return $75,000 to the trust over 12 months. In exchange, I would withdraw the petition, stop requesting records, and agree not to discuss the transaction with regulators, investors, or other relatives. You took $165,000. The house has carrying costs, Mom replied. Renovation expenses have already been incurred. Those are Colin's expenses. If you continue this, he could lose his business before it has even begun. Your father's professional reputation will be destroyed. People will assume the worst without understanding our intentions. I folded the agreement and returned it to the envelope. Nora could have lost treatment. She did not. Because strangers donated leave. Because a charity helped with medication. Because I sold her father's car while her money was inside Colin's house. We were going to restore it after the sale. You were also going to sell the property before I could trace it. Mom's expression hardened. Colin moved the date because your lawyer frightened potential buyers. No, he moved it because he knew the truth was about to catch him. She lowered her voice. Think carefully about what public accusations will do to this family. Why is your reputation more important than what Nora almost lost? We are offering you a solution. You are offering me less than half the money, in exchange for helping you hide the rest. I handed the envelope back. Tell Colin to cancel the open house. Tell Dad to leave the gas system alone. Return everything, and let Naomi put the agreement through the court. Mom stared at me for several seconds. Your father knows what he is doing. I watched him remove the warning tag. It was an unnecessary delay caused by an overcautious contractor. I thought of the sealed windows, the candles, the scent machines, and Colin saying they needed the house to function only long enough for photographs. Then I hope his confidence is worth what all of you are risking. Mom left without saying goodbye. 2 days later, Nora and I were back at the hospital for another infusion when every television in the waiting area switched to local breaking news. A reporter stood behind police tape on a street I recognized immediately. Smoke rolled from what remained of the front windows. The wide porch had partially collapsed, and glass covered the lawn beneath the silver maple trees. The address appeared across the bottom of the screen. Colin's house. My phone began vibrating. First Naomi, then a coworker, then Mom. I answered Naomi. There was an explosion at the property, she said. Do not contact your parents about the trust tonight. The building is now an active fire and safety investigation. Any evidence inside must be preserved by the authorities. On the television, firefighters carried a stretcher from the side yard. The reporter said one man had been found near the rear exit, and another had remained trapped inside until rescue crews reached him. Dad was the man near the door. Colin had been inside longer. Mom called again. This time I answered. Her voice came through beneath sirens and hospital announcements. Douglas is conscious. Colin is in surgery. They said there was internal bleeding and severe trauma. I looked across the infusion room. Nora was watching a movie through headphones, unaware that the house once purchased in her name had become a blackened shell. Which hospital? I asked. Mom told me. It was across the city. I did not go that night. Colin already had surgeons, emergency blood, and an intensive care team. Nothing about his initial survival depended on me, and Nora still had medication running into her arm. Naomi confirmed later that investigators had secured the property. The open house was canceled. The listing disappeared, and the house my parents had tried to sell before the court could reach it had become evidence no one in the family could move. For the next 24 hours, I received only fragments of information. Colin survived surgery but remained in intensive care. Dad was treated for burns, smoke exposure, and a fractured wrist. Mom stayed at Colin's bedside and sent no details beyond requests for prayer. The following evening, she called while Nora slept in the hospital recliner beside me. The surgeons controlled the largest sources of bleeding, Mom said. But his platelet count keeps falling. The transfusions aren't giving them the increase they need. I said nothing. She explained that Colin's previous construction accident had required multiple surgeries and repeated blood products. The transfusion specialist now suspected that antibodies from those earlier treatments were contributing to his poor response to ordinary platelets. The regional blood center was searching for a compatible unit, but the doctors wanted close relatives tested for HLA matching. They have other searches running, Mom said quickly. But siblings are often the best place to start, and you're his only sister. My eyes moved from Nora's sleeping face to the petition and accounting documents open on my laptop. Mom's breath broke over the phone. The blood bank says a sibling is his best chance. Aaron, please come. Please let them test you. Before I went to the hospital, I asked Karen to stay with Nora for the afternoon. Nora had completed her infusion and was tired enough to sleep, but she still watched me put on my coat. Is Uncle Colin dying? She asked. I don't know. Are you going to help him? I sat beside her and smoothed the edge of her knitted cap. I'm going to speak with his doctors and find out what they need. She studied my face with the seriousness illness had forced on her far too young. Grandma didn't help me. I know. Nora waited for the rest of my answer. What they did was wrong, I said. But I have to decide what kind of person I am, not what kind of people they are. At the hospital, a transfusion specialist explained Colin's condition before I was allowed near the ICU. Emergency blood products and surgery had controlled the immediate danger, but trauma, inflammation, and ongoing bleeding had pushed his platelet count dangerously low. Ordinary platelet transfusions were not producing the increase the medical team needed. Because Colin had received repeated blood products during his earlier construction accident, testing showed that he had developed antibodies against certain HLA markers. The regional blood center was already searching its donor registry for compatible platelets. His doctors were also testing close relatives because siblings sometimes shared enough HLA characteristics to provide a useful match. You are not his only possible donor, the specialist told me. We cannot promise you will match, and even a matched donation does not guarantee an outcome. It may give his team another option. That distinction mattered. My parents had described me as Colin's only chance because desperation made the story sound cleaner. The doctors described probabilities, alternatives, and risks. I completed the health questionnaire, allowed them to draw blood for HLA testing, and signed consent for a donor evaluation. Only after those steps did I walk toward the ICU waiting area. Mom's hands were clasped so tightly that her wedding ring had turned the skin beneath it white. The ER and the surgeons kept him alive, she whispered, but his platelet count keeps collapsing. The blood bank says a sibling is their best lead for an HLA-compatible donor. Erin, please let them test you. Behind her, the ICU doors opened and closed. Every time they moved, I saw blue scrubs, monitor lights, and Dad sitting beneath a television, with soot still embedded in the lines of his face. His fractured wrist was wrapped against his chest. A burn dressing covered one side of his neck. A year earlier, those same hands had pushed a blue folder across a hospital table and ended support for Nora's treatment in less than 3 minutes. We're out of money. Handle it yourself. Now, Mom reached for me. I stepped back. Family is supposed to show up when it matters, she said. Through the glass, Colin lay beneath tubes and bandages. For one moment, I remembered the boy who had held the back of my bicycle seat until I found my balance. Then I remembered the man who signed Nora's name beneath a false promise and told me property held value when treatment did not. Mom's voice broke. Please save your brother. I let the silence remain until both of my parents believed I had come only to refuse them. Then I said the words they had taught me. I don't think this is a good investment. Mom's face went pale. Dad pushed himself upright. Erin, he said, whatever happened with the trust has nothing to do with whether Colin lives. That is exactly what I told you about Nora. Mom covered her mouth. Dad looked toward the ICU doors as though the doctors might rescue him from the conversation. I took the signed donor evaluation form from my bag and placed it on the table. Good thing I don't decide who deserves to live by what they can give me, I said. I agreed to be tested before I came in here. Mom made a sound between a sob and a gasp. She moved forward to embrace me, but I stepped aside. I am not doing this for you. You are still our daughter, she said. I was your daughter when you watched me sell Adam's car. Dad stood beside her. If Colin survives, we will repair everything that has happened in this family. Saving Colin is not a settlement. We can return the money, he said. I will sign whatever Naomi wants tonight. Call her and withdraw the petition. Mom seized the opening. Nora is responding to treatment. She has help now. There is no reason to destroy Colin's future when the damage can still be corrected privately. Even there, with one child asleep after treatment and the other lying in intensive care, they were still deciding whose future deserved protection. You are not offering accountability, I said. You are trying to buy silence while Colin cannot even speak for himself. Dad's jaw tightened. Do not pretend this is only about justice. Part of you wants us punished. Part of me does. That does not make the evidence disappear. A nurse came to take me back for additional screening. Mom asked how long the testing would take. The nurse told her the laboratory would compare my HLA profile with Colin's and the blood center's requirements, but no one could promise a match or an immediate donation. Several hours later, the transfusion specialist returned. My results showed that I was a strong match for the markers causing the greatest concern. I passed the initial health assessment and was directed to the hospital's affiliated blood center for platelet donation. The process was nothing like the direct transfer my mother had imagined. I sat beside an apheresis machine while blood traveled through sterile tubing. The platelets were separated, and the remaining components returned to me. The machine clicked and hummed for more than an hour. Staff collected additional samples for the required infectious disease testing and explained that the unit still had to be processed and released by the blood bank before it could be transfused. My lips tingled from the anticoagulant. A nurse adjusted the calcium drink beside me and told me to signal if the sensation worsened. As the machine worked, I remembered Colin running behind my bicycle in our old driveway. I had shouted for him not to let go. He promised he would not, then released the seat anyway, because I would never learn while depending on his hand. When I reached the end of the block and turned around, he was standing far behind me, cheering. That boy had loved me. I could admit that without lying about the man he had become. Loving who he once was did not require me to protect what he had done. The blood center never told me that my platelets alone would save him. Colin received compatible support through the broader search as well as the unit collected from me. By the following morning, his doctors said his platelet count had improved enough for them to manage the bleeding more effectively. He remains critically ill, the hematologist warned. This is progress, not certainty. Mom cried against Dad's shoulder. You saved this family, she told me. No, I said. I helped save Colin. My phone rang before she could answer. Naomi told me the probate court had accepted the petition and supporting documents. The request for a full accounting and preservation of the property was officially pending. Fire investigators had sealed the house and taken control of equipment and construction records connected to the explosion. No one in my family could sell it, repair it, or remove anything without authorization. I did not yet know what the investigators would find. I only knew the house was no longer an investment they controlled. It was an asset tied to Nora's trust and an active scene authorities intended to preserve. That evening, a nurse allowed me into Colin's room for 2 minutes. His face was swollen, and every breath seemed to require concentration. I stood beside the bed, without touching him. His eyelids moved. After several attempts, he focused on me. You came, he whispered. I placed a copy of the certification bearing his signature on the table beside his bed. Yes, I said, and so did the truth. Colin remained in intensive care for 6 more days before the doctors moved him to a surgical recovery unit. He could breathe without a ventilator, but speaking exhausted him, and he needed help sitting upright. The burns along his shoulder and neck would require months of treatment. His right leg had been stabilized with metal hardware, and no one could tell him when he would walk normally again. The first public statement about the explosion did not come from the fire department or the hospital. It came from Colin. Mom held his phone while he dictated a message from his bed. A photograph showed him beneath a white blanket, pale but smiling weakly, with Mom and Dad standing beside him. My sister Erin reminded all of us that family rises above misunderstandings. Her donation helped give me another chance, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful. We are healing together, privately, as a family. He did not mention Nora. He did not mention the trust, the false certification, or the house purchased in my daughter's name. Within an hour, relatives I had not heard from in years began messaging me. One aunt wrote that she was proud I had chosen love over resentment. A cousin said she hoped I would now stop letting money divide the family. Someone else shared Colin's post with the caption, "Forgiveness is the greatest medicine." I saved screenshots of every message and replied to none of them. Mom called that evening. People are relieved, she said. They know you came through when it mattered. I came through for Colin's doctors. You saved your brother. Whatever anger existed before this, you proved family still comes first. You are using my decision to rewrite what happened. I am trying to protect everyone from unnecessary humiliation. The truth is not humiliation. What you did is... Her voice dropped. Colin nearly died. Nora could have lost treatment while her money was trapped in his house. She didn't. That sentence had become my mother's favorite defense. If the worst possible outcome had not occurred, she believed the choice that risked it no longer mattered. The next morning, a delivery arrived at our apartment. Inside was an expensive art set, a stuffed rabbit, and a card written in Mom's careful handwriting. Family forgives. We hope Nora will too. Nora held the rabbit by one ear. Did Grandma say sorry? I took the card from her before answering. No. Then why did she send this? Because sometimes people want forgiveness before they admit what they did. Nora considered that, then placed the rabbit back in the box. Can we send it back? I resealed the package and arranged the return that afternoon. Colin asked to see me 2 days later. Naomi advised me to meet him only if I wanted to, and to keep the conversation focused. The court proceedings were moving forward, and anything he said privately could later become disputed. He was sitting beside the hospital window when I arrived, one leg elevated and his left arm wrapped in dressings. He looked older than he had before the explosion. Pain had removed the easy confidence he once wore like a tailored jacket. You didn't answer my post, he said. I didn't agree with it. I thanked you. You told everyone I forgave you. He looked down at his hands. I said we were healing. You were healing. That is not the same thing. I placed another copy of the certification on the tray table between us. He closed his eyes when he saw his signature. I didn't know every detail, he said. Mom handled the trust. Dad handled the property work. I signed what they put in front of me. You knew the document said the house was for Nora. I thought the trust would be repaid. You knew she needed that money before the house sold. I didn't know how serious things were. You stood in the kitchen and told me treatment could fail while property held value. His jaw tightened. I had just survived a major business risk. I was trying to defend the project. You were defending it before the explosion, too. He pushed the paper away. I almost died in that house, and Nora almost lost treatment because of it. I am not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you not to destroy everything after you just helped save my life. I looked at the machines beside his bed. Those are two separate things. They don't feel separate to me. You think because I helped you live, I owe you protection from what you did. I think it should mean something. It means I did not let your choices turn me into someone who decides whether another person deserves medical help. He looked toward the window. You always believed you were better than me. No, I believed there was still enough of my brother left for the truth to matter. I made one mistake. I tapped the signature. You knew enough to sign your name. He had no answer. Before I left, he told me Mom believed the court would treat everything as a family accounting dispute. Dad believed the explosion was Miguel's fault for failing to complete the work. Colin believed the house insurance would pay enough to restore the trust and end the case. They still thought money could erase intent. Naomi called me into her office the following afternoon. The probate court had issued a temporary preservation order preventing WCR Holdings, my parents, or anyone acting for them from transferring the property, insurance proceeds, or related accounts without notice to the court. It is not a final ruling, she warned. It only keeps the assets from moving while the accounting is completed. The house was already sealed by fire investigators, but the order mattered because any insurance payment, sale of the damaged structure, or movement of remaining funds would now be traceable. Naomi had also received the first summary from the fire investigation and records produced under the preservation requests. Miguel's original report confirmed that he had attached a red warning tag and directly ordered the gas system shut down until inspection. Photographs showed the tag in place. A later image taken after my parents' preview showed the tag missing. Phone records preserved from Colin's damaged device contained a text Miguel sent the day before the explosion. The altered line is not cleared. Do not operate the appliances. Shut off the supply and ventilate the property until the city inspection. Colin had answered 12 minutes later. We only need it running through the showing. Dad says he has it under control. I read the message twice. The words did not shock me because I had already heard Colin say nearly the same thing at the house. What changed was that his choice now existed in a record he could not dismiss as my interpretation. The insurance company had not denied the claim. Instead, it issued a reservation of rights letter stating that coverage remained under investigation because of unpermitted modifications, possible misrepresentation of the property's intended use, and operation of equipment after a documented safety warning. Dad responded by blaming Miguel for abandoning the project. Mom told relatives the insurer was delaying payment because Naomi had complicated the case. Colin's attorney argued that my donation proved the family relationship remained intact and that the dispute should be settled privately. No one said how helping save a life transformed false documents into honest ones, but they repeated the idea often enough that some relatives began treating it as fact. At home, Nora was drawing at the kitchen table when she asked the question I had known would come. Why did you help Uncle Colin if he did something bad? I sat beside her. Because helping someone and trusting them are not the same thing. Do you trust him? No. Do you love him? I looked at the small house on her paper. This one had a blue door, but it was closed. I love parts of who he used to be. I don't have to pretend the person he is now is safe. Nora nodded and returned to coloring. Children sometimes accepted boundaries more easily than adults because they had not yet learned to confuse forgiveness with surrender. 2 weeks later, Naomi received the first full accounting produced under the court order. She asked me to sit before she opened it. The original $165,000 was only the beginning. The trust had also paid property taxes labeled as medical housing costs, utility deposits, described as patient accommodations, landscaping billed as accessibility work, and several maintenance invoices tied directly to Colin's renovation company. The total exceeded $240,000. Naomi turned the final page toward me. Even if the damaged house were sold for its current value, it would not be enough to repay everything they had taken from Nora. The Franklin County Probate Court did not look like the courtroom dramas Colin liked to quote when he wanted to sound powerful. There was no jury, no row of reporters, and no judge waiting to deliver a speech about justice. There were fluorescent lights, polished wooden tables, stacks of exhibits, and a digital clock that made every minute feel administrative. That plainness made the truth more frightening. My parents sat together at the opposite table. Mom wore a navy suit and the pearl earrings she reserved for charity boards and important bank meetings. Dad's burns had healed into red patches along his neck, and his fractured wrist was no longer wrapped. Colin sat beside them with a cane leaning against his chair. For the first time in my life, he did not look like the center of the family. He looked like one of 3 people waiting for someone else to decide what their choices meant. Naomi began with the trust document. She showed that Adam's insurance money had been placed into the Nora Lawson Irrevocable Medical Support Trust for treatment, medication, recovery, and housing directly connected to Nora's medical care. She then placed the wire confirmation beside it. $165,000 had left Nora's trust and entered the title company's escrow account on the day WCR Holdings purchased the house. The next exhibit was Mom's certification, stating that the property was necessary temporary medical housing for Nora. Dad's report claimed the renovation would create a safe recovery environment suited to her needs. Colin's signed statement promised Nora priority use throughout treatment. Naomi did not raise her voice. Nora Lawson never occupied the property, she said. Her mother was never given a key, a lease, an ownership interest, or even notice that the trust had purchased it. Mom's attorney stood and argued that the house had been intended as a long-term investment for Nora's benefit. When Mom was called to explain, she spoke with the calm authority she had used in the hospital consultation room. The treatment was consuming the trust rapidly, she said. We believed converting cash into an appreciating property would preserve resources for Nora's future care. Naomi handed her the closing documents. Where is Nora's ownership interest recorded? Mom looked down. The property was held through WCR Holdings for operational efficiency. Where is the agreement requiring WCR Holdings to repay the trust? We understood that repayment would occur after the sale. Where is that understanding written? Mom's silence lasted longer this time. Naomi continued. There had been no independent appraisal before the purchase. No vote recorded in the trust file. No lease granting Nora access. No repayment schedule. No security interest protecting her money. No written plan showing that the property would ever serve a medical purpose. What existed were invoices. Property taxes had been labeled as medical housing costs. Utility deposits were described as patient accommodations. Landscaping had been billed as accessibility work, although the yard had been redesigned for resale photographs. Maintenance payments had gone directly to Colin's company. The total exceeded $240,000. Mom finally lost her composure. We were trying to create something that would grow, she said. Aaron was spending from the trust as though it could never run out. I felt the old instinct to defend myself rise, but Naomi placed one hand lightly on my arm. The records had already answered for me. Dad took the witness seat next. He said Mom handled the finances, and Colin controlled WCR Holdings. He described himself as an unpaid construction advisor who trusted that the transaction had been properly structured. Mom turned toward him. You proposed the house, she said. Her attorney whispered for her to stop, but she did not. You said cash was dying inside hospital bills. You called the property a living asset. Dad's face darkened. You approved every transfer, because you said Colin could double the money. The alliance that had survived hospital rooms, legal notices, and an explosion began to collapse over which of them had invented the lie first. Colin tried a different defense. He said he relied on his parents' experience. He admitted signing the certification, but claimed he believed the trust would be repaid before Nora suffered any harm. Naomi displayed an email he had sent Mom 2 days before the transfer. Describe it as a recovery residence. The administrator keeps asking how the purchase directly benefits Nora, and we need the funds released before the seller walks. Colin shifted in his chair. Naomi placed his signed certification beside the email. You did not merely sign language someone else prepared, she said. You requested the language that made the release possible. He looked toward me. I remembered his hospital room, and the way he had told me he did not know every detail. You knew enough to sign your name, I said. The judge reminded me to direct my comments through counsel, but she did not order the sentence stricken. It remained in the room with Colin's email. Miguel Santos testified by video later that afternoon. He explained that he had found an unstable pressure reading and an altered gas connection that had not been permitted or inspected. He had attached a red warning tag, ordered the system shut down, photographed the condition, and sent written instructions after learning that the tag had been removed. The text exchange between him and Colin was entered into the record. Miguel had warned them not to operate the appliances. Colin had replied that they needed the system working only through the showing because Dad had it under control. The judge clarified that the hearing was not determining criminal responsibility for the explosion. The evidence mattered because it showed how the property had been managed after trust money was placed into it. They had treated safety the same way they had treated Nora's care. Anything standing between them and profit became an inconvenience to be bypassed. The ruling did not arrive as one dramatic declaration. The judge went through each remedy separately. Mom and Dad were suspended immediately as trustees and removed after the court found serious breaches of their duties. An independent successor trustee would control the remaining assets and oversee a complete accounting. I would retain authority to approve expenses directly connected to Nora's medical needs, but the money would no longer sit under the unchecked control of any family member. The court imposed a constructive trust over the damaged house, and any insurance or sale proceeds connected to it. The property could not be transferred outside judicial supervision. Mom, Dad, WCR Holdings, and Colin could be held personally responsible for the amount that could not be recovered from the house. The judge also directed that the relevant records be provided to the appropriate professional and regulatory authorities. She made clear that other agencies would decide whether licensing, civil penalties, or further proceedings were warranted. Colin's business partner withdrew before we left the courthouse. I saw the message appear on his phone as he stood in the hallway. By the following morning, the brokerage overseeing his license announced that he had been placed on administrative leave while the state reviewed the transaction. The woman who had appeared beside him in several promotional photographs removed every trace of their relationship from her social media accounts. Colin later told a relative she had ended their engagement because she could not build a future with someone whose first project had been financed by a sick child's trust. He survived the explosion, but the identity my parents had built around him did not. Outside the courtroom, Mom followed me toward the elevator. "Are you really going to take Nora's grandparents away from her over money?" I turned around. "You made money the test of whether she deserved support. We made a mistake." "No. You made documents, transfers, invoices, and excuses. A mistake happens once. You repeated this every time you had a chance to stop." Dad stood several feet behind her. Colin leaned against the wall with his cane and did not look at me. Mom's eyes filled with tears. "What do you want from us?" "I want you to stop contacting Nora directly. No gifts, no hospital visits, and no messages through relatives. Any future contact will happen only if I decide it is safe, and only after you take responsibility without asking me to protect you from the consequences. You cannot erase us from her life. You nearly erased her future from your accounting." The elevator opened. I stepped inside beside Naomi and watched the doors close on the family I had spent years trying to convince to choose me. I did not feel victorious. I felt free from needing them to admit what the documents had already proven. That evening, I returned to the hospital for Nora's appointment. She was sitting beside the window with her sketchbook open across her knees. She had drawn a small house with 2 windows, a crooked chimney, and a blue front door. For the first time, the house had a door in the right place. I sat beside her. "Is it open?" Nora shook her head and colored carefully around the frame. "Not yet," she said. The door remained closed, but at least she had begun to believe one could exist. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came over the next 9 months in envelopes, hearings, canceled contracts, and phone calls no one in my family could charm their way out of. The insurance company completed its investigation first. It agreed to cover a limited portion of the structural damage, but refused payment connected to the unpermitted gas modifications, the operation of equipment after a written safety warning, and several statements made about the property's intended use. The money that remained was placed under court supervision and applied toward Nora's trust. The damaged house sold for far less than Colin had once promised investors. Smoke had stained the upper floor. Part of the rear structure had to be removed, and every potential buyer knew the property came with legal records documenting the explosion. The oversized brass key Colin had held beneath the silver banner was probably still buried somewhere beneath broken plaster and wet insulation. Even after the sale and the insurance payment, the trust was not whole. Mom and Dad sold a small lake cottage they had owned for almost 15 years. They also withdrew part of their retirement savings to satisfy the repayment order. Dad's contractor registration was suspended while the state reviewed the unpermitted work and his decision to remove a safety tag. He stopped introducing himself as a builder after that. Mom resigned from the board of a local children's charity when the accounting records became part of the public court file. Her resignation letter described the case as a private family misunderstanding that had been distorted by legal proceedings. She never mentioned that she had labeled landscaping and utility deposits as medical expenses for her granddaughter. Colin accepted a lengthy suspension of his real estate license rather than fight every finding. His business partner withdrew permanently. The investors who had attended the private preview stopped returning his calls. He moved into a small rental near his physical therapy clinic and took administrative work for another brokerage because he could no longer negotiate or sign transactions himself. He was alive, but he was no longer the proof of success my parents had displayed whenever they wanted me to feel like the disappointing child. 3 months after the hearing, a letter arrived from him. His handwriting had changed after the explosion. The letters leaned unevenly, and several words had been crossed out where his injured hand had failed to cooperate. He thanked me for being tested, for donating platelets, and for coming to his hospital room when I had every reason to stay away. He wrote that physical therapy was teaching him patience. He said he had replayed our argument in the house more times than he could count. Near the end, he wrote, "I hope someday you understand I never meant for Nora to be hurt." I read that sentence twice. Colin still wanted his intentions measured more generously than his actions. He had not meant for Nora to lose treatment, just as he had not meant for the house to explode. He had only signed the paper, accepted the money, ignored the warning, and trusted that consequences would belong to someone else. I placed the letter in Adam's lockbox with the trust documents. I did not answer it. Silence was not revenge. It was the space I needed before deciding whether Colin could ever return to our lives in a form that did not require Nora or me to forget what he had done. Mom's apology came a month later through Naomi, because I had blocked her number. She wrote that she accepted responsibility for allowing a financial strategy to damage family trust. She said she missed Nora every day and wanted the opportunity to rebuild our family exactly as it had been before. That was the problem. Before meant a family where Colin's ambitions were called plans, while my needs were called emergencies. Before meant my parents made decisions, and I softened their cruelty so Nora would continue loving them. Before meant they could fail us, and expect access to remain unchanged. I sent one response through Naomi. I do not want our family restored to what it was. Nora needs safety more than she needs a reunion. There will be no direct contact, gifts, visits, or messages through relatives. I am not deciding what forever looks like today. I am deciding what is safe now. Mom sent nothing after that. Nora's treatment continued. There was no single appointment where Dr. Shaw declared the danger gone. There were scans that looked better than the ones before them, blood tests that made us breathe easier, and other tests that had to be repeated because one number moved in the wrong direction. Eventually, Dr. Shaw told us Nora had responded well enough to move from active treatment into a closely monitored phase. We would return regularly, and every visit would carry the possibility of hearing something neither of us wanted to hear. Nora asked whether that meant she was cured. "It means your body is doing well," Dr. Shaw said. "It also means we keep watching carefully." On the way home, Nora stared out the bus window. "Can we be happy if we still have to be scared?" "Yes," I said. "We can be both." The restored trust covered her remaining medical costs, therapy, and the expenses connected to follow-up care. I did not use it to rebuild the lifestyle we had lost. The money belonged to Nora's health and future, not to my need to replace everything quickly. I kept working. I stayed in the small apartment until my savings and income were stable enough to make a decision without touching the trust. 7 months after the court hearing, I found a modest house on a quiet street 20 minutes from the hospital. It had faded green siding, a narrow yard, and a kitchen door that squealed every time it opened. One bedroom had wallpaper, covered with tiny blue flowers. The back steps leaned slightly, but had passed inspection, and the gas lines had been checked by a licensed contractor whose report I read twice before signing anything. It was not an investment project. There were no marble counters, professional photographs, or banners across the porch. I bought it with my salary, the money I had saved, and a conventional mortgage in my own name. On the day we received the keys, I took Nora there after school. She stood on the front path with her backpack still hanging from one shoulder. "Is this really ours?" she asked. "It belongs to the bank more than I would like," I said. "But yes, this is our home." I placed a small silver key in her palm. It looked almost insignificant, compared with the giant brass key Colin had once carried for photographs. "This key does not mean you are an investment," I told her. "It does not mean you earned this house by being brave, or sick, or good. It only means you have a place to come back to." Nora closed her fingers around it. "Even when I'm difficult?" "Especially then." We painted her room together. She chose a pale yellow that required 3 coats to cover the blue flowers. We replaced 2 cabinet handles, planted herbs in cracked pots beside the kitchen window, and learned that the squealing door became quiet if we lifted it slightly while closing it. None of the repairs increased the property value enough to matter. They mattered because Nora chose the paint, because I burned the first dinner in our oven, and because we laughed while chasing a moth through the living room with an empty cereal box. A week after we moved in, I found a new drawing attached to the refrigerator with a red magnet. The house had green walls and a crooked chimney. The front door stood open. Light spilled across the steps, and 2 figures stood inside holding hands. Beneath the picture, Nora had written, "A home is where nobody has to earn the right to stay." I stood there until she came into the kitchen and slipped her hand into mine. My parents had taught me one true thing in the cruelest way possible. Every choice was an investment in the person I would become. They invested in appearances, profit, and the belief that consequences could always be negotiated later. I invested in Nora. I invested in the truth. I invested in the part of myself that could help save Colin without surrendering my daughter's right to justice. My parents had chosen a house because they believed property lasted longer than people. They were wrong. The house was gone. What remained was my daughter's hand in mine, a small key warming her palm, and a door neither of us would ever have to beg to enter again.